You are now our audiovisual expert for the semester. Did you get a
sign-in sheet?
PowerPoint from me today?
Yes. Yes, it did. Yes.
My computer first told me that there was too much information on it, which seemed odd because
it was a big document. I think it was 32 megabytes or something.
Yeah.
So
did come
at least to me. So.
Okay. Good evening.
Good evening.
Let's start this round.
Thank you.
Have I run half the class on? Oh, sorry. Okay, let's get started. Last class period we were doing a handout on, I apologize for being so disorganized today. I've been in hand-to-hand combat with the landlord I'm running for a year this afternoon. I'm trying to get my brain wrapped around secured transactions instead of guerrilla warfare. We were doing handout number 2, that's what I was trying to think of, on the law of personal property. And I think we did a pretty fair job of working our way through the voidable title concept. The key thing to remember there is that the general rule is the rule we call the rule of Nemo Dot. You can only transfer what you have, but there are exceptions. And there are circumstances in which one can transfer a greater property right than one has. Voidable title doctrine, we learned that if one has voidable title, one can transfer a good title, but then we've got to identify the person that can receive that greater property interest, and that person has to be a good faith purchaser for value. We talked about how broad the term purchaser is, and we'll hit that again and again during the semester. We haven't defined value yet, but if one is buying something and paying a price, or contracting to pay a price, that certainly is obviously value to you. And with regard to good faith, as I indicated last time, we're just going to assume it, unless the facts tell you that somebody's lying, cheating, stealing, or something of the sort, because I really don't want to test on good faith in a course like this. We've talked about that as much as we're going to. So then we got into a sort of an offshoot, if you will. It's really a different doctrine. But I did want to introduce you to the concept of bailments. And again, a bailment is usually applied to goods. Sometimes people are a little sloppy about it, and if for example, I were to ask you to hold a negotiable instrument for me, that's not goods. We would technically call that a bailment, and the common law rules of bailment really shouldn't apply. But courts get a little sloppy. But for our purposes, we'll only talk about goods because I'm trying to teach a general principle as opposed to digging down in detail into the area of the law. So in a bailment, the key is that one party in possession of goods turns over possession to somebody else. In our examples, we started with an owner, and I don't want to get more complicated than that. Turning over possession of goods to someone who doesn't get title. The typical example is something like the example in the material. You take your computer in and drop it off at a shop to have it repaired. And of course, ownership doesn't pass. And so we talk about the bailor and the bailee. In Article 2 terms, we can call them the entruster and the entrustee. But they're really the same thing. Article 2 entrustment, that term is just a fancy term for a common law bailment. And there are two things, maybe a couple of things to remember about The bailment situation. Number one, of course, we start off with the idea that title doesn't transfer from the bailor to the bailee. Therefore, you shouldn't talk about voidable title. The rules on voidable title have no application to this area. Secondly, the general rule, the common law rule of bailments. Bailments is a big area of the law that is only codified here and there. I mean, Article 2A on leases is a codification of a big area of bailment law, but most bailment law is just not codified. There's a lot of common law out there on this topic. So, in a bailment situation, generally speaking, creditors of the bailee cannot reach an asset. If the owner claims it back, the owner gets it back. And purchasers from a bailee cannot take an interest in the asset that defeats the owner. In other words, the owner is protected against creditors of and purchasers from the bailee. Article 2 creates one exception, and there's a famous case involving the jewelry company Harry Winston, in which somebody took a ring in to Harry Winston to have it adjusted, and someone in the store made a mistake and put it in the inventory to sell. And it wasn't fraudulent, it was just a mistake. They're supposed to fix the ring and give it back. Instead, they put the ring in a display case, they sell it, and now the owner wants to get it back from the person that bought it. And we introduced you to the term buyer in ordinary course of business. For shorthand, I called it a biocod. I actually hate that, but I don't want us to. Well, I don't mind saying buyer in ordinary course of business. I don't want to write it out on the board whenever we come to it. So I'll use the shorthand. And it's just a special kind of buyer. And it is a buyer who, of course, is in good faith, of course, gives value, but buys from someone in the business of selling goods of that kind. That's sort of a hallmark. That's when you know you're dealing, well, you know you might be dealing with a buyer in ordinary course of business. Someone who buys from someone who is in the business of selling goods of that kind. And the little Article 2 rule resolves the Harry Winston problem in favor of the buyer. Okay? The Article 2 rule is if you bail goods with someone in the business of selling goods of the kind, then you will lose if they happen to sell it to someone who qualifies as a buyer in ordinary course of business. Notice that the class of parties that can take advantage of the rule is much narrower than the class of parties that can take advantage of the voidable title rule. A person with voidable title can transfer good title, an unassailable property interest, if you will, to a good faith purchaser for value. Purchaser is a broad term. It includes secured parties, it includes buyers, it includes lessees. So that's a broad group that can take advantage of that rule. Only a person who qualifies as a buyer is a subset of purchaser in ordinary course of business can take advantage of the entrustment rule. So we've got some problems here, and I'm going to give you my answers to the problems real quickly and let you ask me questions rather than trying to get you all to answer the questions. So, because I want to do this quickly. But as much as I want to do things quickly, as much as I may race at some point in the semester, you are always going to start slowly to understand the concept, okay? So problem 7, owner drops his computer off at electronic wizard, repair electronic wizard repairs, but does not sell computers. Okay, you've now been told that nobody can acquire an interest that will beat the owner's interest, right? They don't sell computers of that type. It's a bailment situation, they don't sell computers. So you know that right off the get-go. Electronic Wizards fraudulently sells the computer to the computer store, which buys and sells used computers. What are owners' rights against the computer store? And the answer is that the only person that can take that kind of take rights greater than the entrustor, greater than the owner here, greater than the bailor. And I'm using bailor and entrustor interchangeably because I want to stress the point that Article 2 uses entrustment, but it's really a bailment. This is a purchaser from Bailey.
Excuse me.
The common law rule applies. The owner's interest is protected against purchasers from the Bailey. The purchaser is, if the owner finds the computer, the owner can get it back. What's our mechanism? Remember, replevin. You can file a legal action to get it back. And if the owner demands it back and it isn't returned, and the owner decides not to replevy it, the owner's alternative mechanism for getting it back would be a lawsuit in conversion, right? Remember that from last time? As against the entrustor, there's a conversion there as well. You also have a breach of contract if you wish. So you always have plenty of theories against the person who either makes the mistake or acts fraudulently. You need not worry. And just to bring it kind of full circle, if the owner gets the computer back from the buyer is going to be unhappy and is going to want to go back against the electronic wizards that sold it, and that cause of action is breach of warranty of title. If you sell goods you warranty, you have good title to them. So those are my answers. In problem 7, suppose all assets of electronic wizards have been subject to bank security interest. Suppose also that electronic wizards defaults to bank, which repossesses owner's computer along with all the other computers in the store. What are owner's rights against bank? It's still problem 7. Nobody can beat the owner. The owner is protected against purchasers from, that's problem 7, and creditors of. Although a secured party really fits both categories. A secured party is a purchaser, but is also a creditor. But it doesn't matter which side of the fence I'm on, the purchaser side or the creditor side, the secured party loses. The secured party is a converter. Owner can replevy the goods. If owner demands them back and they're not returned, secured party is liable for breach of, liable for conversion. This time there wouldn't be a warranty of title action by the bank back against electronic wizards because they didn't buy it. But they loaned money, right? They're entitled to recover the amount of the loan. That's their cause of action back against electronic wizards. They take that action on the debt, sue them, get a judgment, go start grabbing the stuff, but not this computer. So we all okay with it? And then problem 9, would your answer to problem 7 or 8 change if in addition to repairing computers, electronic wizards was in the business of selling used computers? My answer to question 8 would not change. The bank who is a secured creditor is a purchaser and a creditor, but not a buyer in the ordinary course of business. In this rule, the only person that can take free of the owner's interest is a person who qualifies as such. And a secured party is a purchaser, but it's not a buyer. And therefore, it can't be a buyer in the ordinary course of business. So my answer to 7 would change, assuming good faith, assuming no information indicating the problem. My answer to 7 would change. If I have a buyer in the ordinary course of business in 7, that buyer wins. Under the facts of problem 9. The electronic wizard sells computers. But my answer to 8 would not. So the entrustment rule of Article 2 is a small but important incursion into the common law rule protecting ownership. Okay? Those are my answers. Any questions? Yes, sir.
I'm trying to figure out is there any remedy to the person who drops their computer off to get it repaired and it's sold by a merchant of that kind?
Well, yeah. I mean, their cause of action is against the merchant, right?
So
and
it just doesn't leave them out.
it's certainly a breach of contract, and it's also a conversion. And if done fraudulently, it would be a conversion with an opportunity for punitive damages. But you know, it's the same with the person who defrauds you out of goods and then title passes to a good faith purchaser for value. And I guess the answer to it, and here's the way to look at it: choose the person you deal with care, right? Okay.
Would you mind if I turn on the wall washers or whatever they're called?
No. In fact, we'd all be better off. I will do it. I got so distracted by the computer lights that I forgot to do that. Sorry. Okay. We okay? All right. Let's move on. Let's really jump into Article 9. And we're going to look at problem set 3. And we are going to talk about the concept of attachment. And we're going to be talking about it all semester. Okay? It is a key Article 9 term. A security interest cannot be enforced. In other words, you don't have a security interest if it has not attached. Now, I will almost always during the semester say something that at a technical level is not quite right, but I can't say it in the technically correct way every time I use the term attachment because it's just too complicated to say. If I take a security interest, if I loan you money and take a security interest in your car, the shorthand way of saying things, if I do everything right, is that my security interest has attached to your car, and that means that it is enforceable. And enforceable simply means that if you default, I get to come repossess the car and sell it at a foreclosure sale and apply the money to the indebtedness, okay? But security interests don't attach to cars. They attach to rights. So the technically correct way of saying it is, my security interest attaches to your rights in the car. Now, your rights, assuming you have full ownership, then my security interest attaches to the entire bundle of rights associated with the car. Right? We think of property rights as bundles. So my security interest does in fact attach functionally to the car, to everything about the car, but technically I should say it attaches only to your rights in the car. Now that would matter if you didn't own the car, if, for example, you had leased it. Then if we say my security interest attaches to the car, it obscures the fact that my security interest can only attach to your rights in the car, that is your right to possess and use the car for the term of the lease. And I've got an example in here that illustrates that, but I want to say at the outset that whereas I will typically say the security interest attaches to the collateral, you all read in that what we really mean is it attaches to the rights, to the debtor's rights in the collateral. Okay? With me? So let's take a look at 9203. And 9203 is one of those pivotal provisions in our agreement. We are going to be able, by the time we're done, to talk about attachment as if it were a responsive reading. I will say attachment requires, and you all will say as one, value must be given, the debtor must have rights or the power to transfer rights in the collateral, and there must be an agreement authenticated by the debtor and describing the collateral, or shorthand, value rights agreement. Value rights agreement, okay? So let's look at 9203 together. A security interest attaches to collateral, and even the code doesn't take the time to say it the right way. We talk about attachment to collateral, but conceptually I want you to think about rights in the collateral. A security interest attaches to collateral when it becomes enforceable against the debtor with respect to the collateral, unless an agreement postpones the time of attachment. We could have an agreement that would say, well, I'll have a security interest in your collateral, but it won't arise now. It will arise upon the happening of some future event. I've never seen that occur. So don't worry about it. For our purposes, attachment and enforceability are interchangeable. They're not literally interchangeable, but for our purposes, they are interchangeable. When your security interest has attached, it is enforceable. When it becomes enforceable, it has attached. Okay? So, part B is really the key here. Except for this, that, and the other, which we don't care about yet, and won't care about for most of the semester. A security interest is enforceable against the debtor and third parties. Because sometimes we have priority contests. You have a security interest in an asset and the debtor then sells it to some third party. And now the question becomes, is my security interest valid against that third party? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes it's no. We're not going to try to resolve those things until we're well down the road. But a security interest can't be enforceable against the debtor or third parties unless, or the way it's phrased here, a security interest is enforceable against the debtor and third parties only if. So here are the three conditions. Value has been given. Given by whom? By the secured party. The secured party must give value for the rights in the collateral. The debtor has rights in the collateral. Remember the definition of debtor? Or someone who has a property interest in the collateral? The debtor must have rights in the collateral or the power to transfer rights in the collateral, and I will come back. That's an echo of the avoidable title rule that we gave you earlier, and I'll come back to the power to transfer rights. It's a very simple point once you understand avoidable title, but for the moment, let's just shorthand it. The debtor has rights in the collateral, and always we understand that could be the power to transfer rights in the collateral. And one of the following conditions is met. And I'm going to use a term, two terms during the semester. And one is going to be a possessory security interest. And one is going to be a non-possessory security interest. Well, let's assume I loan you money and take as collateral a security interest in your Rolex watch. Okay, valuable Rolex watch. Well, somebody's got to have possession of it, right? It exists. So when we say possessory security interest, it means I, the secured party, take possession of it until you repay me. And only when you repay me do I give it back to you. Okay? And if you don't repay me, I don't have to bother going out and repossessing it because I've already got it. I just schedule my sale and I sell it. So a possessory security interest is one in which the secured party is in possession of the collateral. That's pretty rare. I can give you an example of that with a watch. But if for example the collateral is a tractor being used by a farmer on a farm, it makes absolutely no sense for a secured party to take possession of it prior to default because the farmer needs to use it to do whatever work needs to be done on the farm with it. So most security interests are non-possessory. So how does that relate to 9203B? One of the following conditions is met, and only two that we are going to worry about are A and B. Don't worry about C and D. They get into very specialized situations. But I want to start, oddly enough, with B. The collateral is not a certificated security. Well, I'm not even going to talk to you this semester about certificated securities. That's a type of investment property, and the rules in that area are very, very sophisticated. That would be a subject of an advanced course, so don't worry about that language. If you see certificated security, just say, God, I don't have to learn those rules. The collateral is not a certificated security and is in possession of the secured party under section 9313. But 9313 just tells you you can take possession of stuff that's tangible. So 9313 is not a big hurdle there. Is in possession of the secured party under 9313 pursuant to the debtor's security agreement. Okay? So that's describing a possessory security interest. There has to be an agreement. The secured party has to be in possession pursuant to a security agreement. But notice that there's nothing in there about the agreement having to be signed or authenticated in the awkward language of Article 9. I'm usually going to say signed and mean authenticated. But there's nothing in there about that. There's nothing in there about the agreement having to describe the collateral. If you have a non-possessory security interest, then you're in 9203B3A. The debtor has authenticated a security agreement that provides a description of the collateral, and we won't worry about timber today. Probably yet. Okay. So, in the case of a non-possessory security interest, you have to have a signed agreement describing the collateral. In the case of a possessory security interest, you have to have a security agreement. Nothing about sign, nothing about description. Therefore, while it is not prudent business practice to do so, you can, in fact, have an oral security agreement. With a non-possessory security interest, you cannot have an oral security agreement. Okay? You've got to have a signature, you've got to have a description. And you've got to have one other thing. What did the book tell you that one other thing is, which is not stated in the code? Security agreement is an agreement that creates or provides for a security interest. The agreement has to show intent for a security interest to come into existence. If you have an agreement that says, I will give you a security interest sometime in the future, you don't have a security interest. If you have an agreement that says, I will have a security interest commencing on the 3rd of May 2018, you can have a security interest starting on the 3rd of May 2018, but not until then. So generally speaking, unless we have what we think of as present intent, if you get to the 3rd of May 2018, at that point, the intent will have been obvious from the agreement. But normally, as I indicated earlier, parties don't postpone attachment. I really don't see that happening. So providing for a security interest to arise in the future is highly uncommon. So what we're generally looking for is present intent. Present intent to create a security interest. So there are formalities. Signature, description, present intent. Those are necessary. So in all instances, whether you have a possessory security interest or a non-possessory security interest, there are 3 requirements. The secured party must give value, the debtor must have rights in the collateral. In the case of a non-possessory security interest, there has to be a security agreement signed describing the collateral showing present intent. In the case of a possessory security interest, you only have to be able to prove agreement, which can be oral. Again, it's not prudent. You've got proof problems, but nevertheless, theoretically, it can happen.
What were the 3 formalities of the security agreement?
Oh, well, right there in 3A are 2 of them: the authentication requirement, and the description requirement. And the third, if it's going to create a security interest, it has to show present intent to do so. Yep, it's just the intent of the party that a security interest come into existence. Okay.
You said for the possessory interest, you only need, what was that last part you said? You said you only need a security agreement and it can be oral?
You always need a security agreement.
Okay.
If you take possession of the collateral, the agreement can be oral. And and still be enforceable. Okay. So let's run through a few little problems. Problem one here. And when I give you problems that involve the passage of time and different events, I just kind of like to map them out, or graph them out. So the first event that we have is on, and I'm not even going to put this one up there, on June 30, customer asks bank for a $25,000 loan to purchase a piece of equipment for use in customer's plant. That's just a request for a loan. It obviously doesn't have a legal effect. On July 2, bank notifies customer that it will make the loan. Okay, so 7/2, bank will lend. And let's assume that is a binding commitment on the part of the bank. Okay, they've made a credit decision. They've made a binding commitment to extend credit. On July 3, customer goes down to bank and signs 2 documents. And oftentimes, in these kinds of transactions, all of the payment provisions and all of the security interest provisions are in one document. It just part of the document has the payment obligation. Part of the document has the grant of the security interest. But I want us to think functionally about the payment obligation and the security interest differently. So I've put them in different documents here. So the 2 documents are one document captioned security agreement, providing among other things, customer hereby grants bank a security interest. Why is that language important? What does that show? Customer hereby grants bank a security interest. Just present intent, right? By this instrument, I am granting you a security interest. In the following property, it describes the equipment by make, model, and serial number. And to make the problem easy, I put in here that information has been provided by supplier, which has had preliminary discussions with customer, is holding the equipment in the hope that customer will buy it. But there's no contract yet for the customer to buy the piece of equipment. Okay, but we've got a description of it. Supplier is holding it. Right? And the second document is entitled Promissory Note, and it provides that customer will pay for the order of bank the principal sum of $25,000 plus interest at a stated rate in equal monthly installments over a term of 5 years. So there is a promissory note to pay. Just put a $sign out there. And there's a security agreement, and I'll put it on the board so many times I'm going to just put SA, security agreement. Which is signed, describes an asset, and shows intent to create a security interest. Right? So, does the bank have a security interest in this piece of equipment at this point in time? It can't. Debtor doesn't have any rights in the collateral, right? So even though it shows present intent to create a security interest, that intent cannot be effectuated. The parties aren't really agreeing to postpone attachment. What's happening is that functionally attachment has to be postponed. You can't have a security interest unless your debtor has rights in the collateral. So the problem goes on and tells you that on 7/5, the customer buys the piece of equipment from the supplier. Okay? So customer buys. Now, when was value given? The problem also tells you that to pay the seller, the bank wire transfers the purchase price to the seller. Okay? So seller paid wire transfer. So what are the 3 conditions to attachment? Value must be given, the debtor must have rights in the collateral, And this is a non-possessory security interest, so we have to have a security agreement signed describing the collateral, showing present intent. I've given you that that's occurred, right? I've given you that the customer eventually has rights in the collateral, right? So when was value given? Was it when the commitment was made? Was it when the promissory note was signed? Was it when the money was wire transferred to the seller?
Would it be when the credit was extended to the seller? He would need that credit to apply.
I think you're right, but you're using different terms than I did. There was a commitment to extend credit. There was then a promissory note signed promising to repay the amount that would be extended, and then the funds were actually extended by going to the seller of the goods. And at which point which of those 3 points was value given? And I think you said it, but use my way of describing it.
I would say when the bank told them that they were going to lend to them.
When they made a binding commitment. And how do you know that? I mean, you would say that, and intuitively, I think it makes sense. In fact, intuitively, I think it's obvious. But how do you know it?
How do I know that's when they get value? Because then that's when the customer could go and trade on that.
How do you know that there is value for purposes of Article 9 of the Uniform Commercial Code? You go find a provision that tells you what constitutes value. We got to find the answer in the code. See, we've got to reorient our thinking. You're used to being asked what's the right policy, right? I by and large don't care what the right policy is. I actually think the code gets you to the right policy most of the time, and sometimes I think it gets you to the wrong policy. Doesn't matter. You've got provisions and you need to follow them. So where do we find a definition of value?
1204.
Section 1204. And it's in Article 1 because it's used in multiple places throughout the code. So value can arise in several different ways. A person gives value for rights if the person acquires them. Who is the person in that sentence? In my example, I've got a seller, I've got a customer, I've got a bank. Bank, sure. A person, because it's the secured party that has to give the value. Okay, so a person gives value for rights. The rights in this case are the security interest, property rights. If the person acquires them, one, in return for a binding commitment to extend credit. Boom. And again, it states the obvious, but it says it here. And if you're making the argument, you want to find statutory support. Okay? So we will do a little bit more with this. There's a problem that gets into this further, but there's a sort of a catch-all at the end. A person gives value for rights if the person acquires them. 4, the last one, in return for any consideration sufficient to support a simple contract. So if I enter into a contract, then supported by consideration, then I've given value. But that's kind of a catch-all, and we almost never have to drill all the way down to that one. So, when does the security interest attach? What date? 7/5. There are 3 events that must happen, and they can happen in any order. I could have told you that the customer at all times owned this piece of equipment, wasn't buying it. Went down to the bank, applied for a loan. The bank says, well, we'll consider it. We might very well make that loan, but we need all the documentation in hand. We're going to do all our investigation. Come on down, sign the security agreement, and we'll decide whether to fund it once we have all the documents. So in my new example, the customer owned the asset all along. The security agreement was then signed describing it, but value had not yet been given. So all I've done is I've juggled the order in which the 3 events occur, right? There are 3 events that must occur for there to be attachment. They can occur in any order, and when the last of the 3 occurs, the security interest attaches to the collateral, and that means it has become enforceable. And enforceable, what does it mean? If there's a default, default, then you have a right to foreclose, a right to repossess and sell. All right? Questions? I set the problem up this way just because I wanted to point out to you all how many different sets of laws can apply to a single transaction. And actually, it would have been easy to set this up and have 5 more sets of laws apply to it. Question A, does the bank have an enforceable security interest? Yes, value given on 7.2, security agreement authenticated on 7.3, customer acquires rights on 7.5, attachment 7.5. If the equipment does not work satisfactorily, what law will govern customers' warranty rights against the supplier? Article 2. Article 2 deals with sales of goods and the rights arising, but that's focused on the sales aspect, not the secured financing aspect of the transaction. If customer defaults in bank rather than foreclosing on the equipment, chooses to enforce only its collection rights under the note, what law will govern? I don't want you to learn much about the law of negotiable instruments, but I sent you to Article 3. This is those of you who've had the payment systems course know that I set this up as a negotiable instrument. The collection of negotiable instruments is governed by Article 3. If it was a non-negotiable instrument, the collection would be governed by the common law. What law governs the wire transfer of funds? Well, it turns out we have an Article 4A in the Uniform Commercial Code that governs non-consumer. The term in the industry would be wholesale as opposed to retail, but consumer transfers are governed by other sets of laws. So a bank-to-bank transfer would be covered by Article 4A. A bank-to-seller, in my example, as long as it's not a consumer initiating the transfer, then Article 4A governs. I'm not asking you to learn a thing about these sets of laws, right? And what law governs if customer defaults and bank seeks to foreclose on its equipment? Article 9. So we took a little tour of the UCC, didn't we? In one little problem, we invoked Article 2, Article 3, Article 4A, and Article 9. All in one simple problem. But all we care about is the Article 9 set of rules. So in problem 1, suppose customer had assented orally to the security agreement but inadvertently failed to sign it. Would bank security interest attach? The answer is no. What is the purpose of the authentication requirement from the readings? Why is that in there?
Serves as a statute of frauds.
It serves as a statute of frauds. What does that? What carry that a step forward? What does that mean to you?
I guess to certify that the security interest was agreed to by both. Mutual assent, essentially.
Yeah, only the debtor needs to sign it. The secured party doesn't need to sign it, although it typically does.
Right.
It doesn't need to.
In a way, the secured party generally provides the agreement, and the other person or the debtor signs it. Therefore,
That's
mutual
generally true, although when you get into large dollar amounts and you have, large multinational corporations, these things are negotiated down to the last comma. But I think your point is still well taken. Look, I loan you money and I don't get a security interest in anything, and you default. Now I gotta sue you. I gotta get the sheriff to go out and start grabbing stuff, or I gotta garnish your wages if you don't pay me, and all that's a pain. So I really don't want to do that, so I make up a story. Well, so-and-so granted me a security interest in their car. And if I have an Article 9 security interest, now I can just go grab the car, repossess it, and sell it without having to go through all those proceedings. And isn't that tempting? I'm tempted to make it up. I'm tempted to engage in fraud. And the fact that you have signed a security agreement describing the stuff that I get, the stuff that I can get my hands on, operates to make it very difficult for me to engage in that kind of fraud. it is a statute of frauds provision. And the description requirement, I mean, if you just said, I hereby grant you a security interest, what would that even mean? So the description has to be sufficient that we can figure out the intent of the parties. That's all we're looking for. Do I have enough specificity that I can figure out the intent of the parties? The signature is a statute of frauds provision. The description requirement is fleshes out their intent. Okay? Look, I'm going to try to go through these a little fast. Again, you're more than welcome to slow me down.
With the description, if you're really trying to get a security interest basically in everything they own, I mean, how would you do that without them being able to come back and say, oh, well, this wasn't descriptive enough? Like, say they don't really own that much, so you're trying to say in all their assets or all
Yeah,
their
but
property.
if you've read ahead, you see that if you say I take a security interest in all your assets, that is legally insufficient as a matter of law, as a description. All assets will not work. And I don't agree with that rule, by the way. I think you ought to be able to say all assets. The reason it's in the code today is that after the code was first adopted in the 1950s and 60s, all these descriptions, all assets, were used. There wasn't anything in the code about it at that time. And some early courts said, oh, well, that's, how would anybody really understand the reach and power of all assets? Make them spell everything out. So because those decisions were out there when revised Article 9 was put together, those were just enshrined in the statute itself. It seems to me that all that, I give you a security interest in everything I own. It's pretty clear and everybody can understand it. But here's how I'd handle it. There are categories. There are goods. There are collateral types within the code. Goods, accounts, chattel paper. There's about 15 of them. I just list them top to bottom. I take a security interest in all goods. That's okay. I take a security interest in all this. I take a security interest in all that. And if I pile those up one on top of the other, at least when the debtor reads that, the debtor goes, holy, right? That's a lot of stuff. So I think it's sort of a make you pause and think rule.
Okay.
But I can get a security interest in everything that you own that would be subject to Article 9. I can't use Article 9 to get a security interest in your land, for example, because it doesn't extend to real estate. So let's get a little bit ahead of ourselves. Why is it that an oral security agreement is okay if the secured party takes possession of the collateral, since the signature requirement functions as a statute of frauds?
I would say, the signature was also serving to show that the debtor was aware of exactly what the secured party physically has possession. It's pretty clear on both parties.
Yeah, if the debtor turns stuff over, there's some transaction between them, right? There's got to be some transaction. Maybe it's a security interest, but why not let the secured party try to prove that, right? So, and why no requirement that there be a description of the collateral? Because it would be superfluous. The collateral is the stuff you're in possession of. So we don't need a statute of frauds provision, and we don't need a collateral description. Nevertheless, if I'm a secured party and I rely on an oral security agreement, and the debtor comes back and says, now wait just a minute, you gave me $10,000 at the time I turned that over to you, but in fact that was an oral agreement to buy that for $15,000, and you still owe me $5,000. And the person who loaned the $10,000, wait, I never agreed to buy it. That was a loan and a security agreement. Well, there's clearly a transaction between the two, but don't I have a court fight over what kind of transaction it is? So if you rely on an oral security agreement, you are dumb. But it can be legally enforceable under Article 9 if you can prove to the court that the transaction at play is in fact a secure transaction. Okay? So, problem 3. Customer owes bank $10,000. That's a pre-existing obligation. It exists at all times during this problem. While customer is not technically in default, bank is concerned about her deteriorating financial condition. I made it clear that customer is not in default because I don't want customer giving up any, getting a forbearance of the right to sue or something like that. I don't want customer giving up anything along those lines. Bank asks customer to grant it a security interest in the car, which customer owns free and clear. Now, bank has no right to this, right? The way I've set this up, the customer agrees to do it. You don't have to, but you do. Customer agrees to bank's request, signs a security agreement adequately describing her car. Did bank give consideration for the security interest? Trick question. Code doesn't require consideration. Code requires value, but that's not the question I'm asking. So what did the customer give up? I'm sorry, I beg your pardon, I said it backwards. What did the bank give up in exchange for getting this security interest?
They're relieving some debt off of her that she might have to pay,
No, they didn't give up anything.
or potential or debt that.
They didn't give up. They didn't give up anything, did they?
Or giving up a right to
What right did the bank give
collect
up?
on the debt?
What right did the bank
Right.
give up in exchange?
Didn't give up
They just said, we want extra, we want some collateral, we didn't have it before, and the customer who could refuse it said, sure, right? You get these rights in exchange for nothing, at least in terms of contemporaneity. I shouldn't have said that. You don't get anything at the time, right? Now, when you study contracts, and don't worry about this, I will not test you on this. When you I will never test you on first-year contracts concepts, okay? When you study contract, you learned about a pre-existing duty rule. And that is, if a contract is modified, and we're modifying this agreement to add collateral, right? If a contract is modified under the common law, there must be new consideration. You must give something new in order for consideration to be present. So the bank could, for example, have extended additional credit, could have extended the time of payment. You know, it's supposed to be paid back over X months. We'll extend it and give the customer more months. If I had said that the customer was in default and the bank had forgiven the default in exchange for the collateral, it would have relinquished a legal right, right? And I'd have consideration. But I've given you a classic pre-existing duty rule problem, and there is no consideration. Bank gave up nothing. There's no exchange here, okay? But does the code require consideration? It does not. It requires value. Did the bank give value?
Yes, pursuant to the 1204.
Yeah. Show me where it's. You're exactly right. Show me where it says.
Security for in total or partial satisfaction of the pre-existing claim.
Did the bank take the asset in partial satisfaction of the debt? Satisfaction would mean that you reduced the debt.
This is what has the or, so like the part kind of
Okay.
doesn't.
So the only part that you need in there is the as security for, right? So this is a really important point about statutory interpretation. Start at the top of 1204, okay? A person gives value, the secured party gives value for rights if the person acquires them, and then look at paragraph 2. If the person acquires them as security for a pre-existing claim. Right. A person gives value for rights if a person acquires those rights as security for an already existing obligation. Now, I hope when your contracts professor taught you the pre-existing duty rule, that professor also said that among the dumb rules that have ever been developed in the law, that's high on the list. And the Uniform Commercial Code simply throws it out. Okay. So the answer to question 5 is that the bank has a security interest in the car, even though it didn't give anything new. It doesn't have to. The already existing obligation serves as the value for the later acquired security interest. And that's going to be really important down the road. Okay, that's going to be a really important concept. With me? Bank lends customer $15,000. Customer signs a security agreement describing the collateral as all customers' equipment. Is there a description problem? 9108 tells us when you have a good description. Okay? So let's look at it. Remember, if you have a non-possessory security interest, the security agreement must describe the collateral. So let's look at 9108. That's what it tells us. Sufficiency of description. A description of personal or real property. There are a couple of instances in the code in which you may need a description of real property. For example, there was that little rule about timber that I said don't worry about. But if you take a security interest in timber that is going to be severed from the land, the security agreement has to describe the land. So I'm not going to worry you with real property stuff in the semester. But a description of anything is sufficient whether or not it is specific, if it reasonably identifies what is described. So that's the test. Does it reasonably identify what is described? And then look at B. B says, with exceptions, a description of collateral reasonably identifies the collateral if it identifies the collateral by one of 6 ways. Do you have a term for a provision like that? I've got a general test in A. You must reasonably identify the collateral, right? B says you have done it if you do it one of these ways. What would you call that? From safe harbor provision? This is a safe harbor provision. If you do it this way, you're okay. One of these 6 ways. Again, look at the language. A description does reasonably identify. Reasonably identifies. If you do it by specific listing, what do you think that means? Item by item. Item by item. If I'm a farmer and I have 3 tractors and I grant a bank a security interest in my tractor, do you think the bank's security interest attaches to any of my 3? I'm borrowing money. I'm a farmer. I own 3 tractors. I grant the bank a security interest in, quote, my tractor, singular. Have I reasonably identified any of them? So a specific listing describes the item. What if I said my 2013 John Deere X, and that differentiates that from the other tractors I own at the time. So specific listing simply means that we give enough of a description of the item that a court can ascertain the party's intent. Ascertain the party's intent. How would you describe a car in a security agreement?
I was just going to ask about that because I know in the reading it was talking about like make, model, all that, but couldn't you just put the VIN number and be covered?
Yeah, but what if you don't put the VIN number?
So they were saying like make, model, color.
But suppose I own 2 cars, okay? Right now, my wife and I own 2 cars. We have a 2010 Cadillac CTS, which I drive around because it's red and it's got 100,000 miles, but you all don't really have to know that. You can just see me in my red Cadillac. Assume what you like. And we've got a Buick Enclave, okay? So I go down to the bank, I borrow money from the bank, and the bank takes a security interest, and I describe the car, the collateral as my Cadillac. That's all I said. Adequate description. Sure it is. I got 2 cars at the time I signed the security agreement. I referred to my Cadillac. What the heck am I referring to other than the car that I own that's Cadillac? Now, that's not the way banks do it. Banks will want make, model, serial number, color, and most importantly, the VIN number. All right? But there, prior to Article 9, there were what were called chattel mortgage recording acts, and the courts were hostile to them, and courts would often require what they call serial number specificity. That is, on any asset, you better nail it down, and if it's got a serial number, you better put the serial number, and if you transpose 2 numbers in the serial number, you're dead. You don't have a security interest. The code gets away from that. It's prudent. I mean, if I'm describing a car in a security agreement, I'm going to put the vehicle identification number and try to get it right. But I'm not going to be penalized if I make a petty little mistake, as long as we can figure out what the intent of the parties was. How do I know that that's what the drafters intended? I mean, I can sort of intuit it from the reasonably identifies, right? And it says by specific listing. It doesn't say you've got to be so specific that you get down to serial number level.
You have to reasonably identify it sufficiently through a.
But I want a better insight into the drafters intent.
Maybe equity wouldn't allow it if you look back at 1103.
Well, how about comment 2? The purpose of requiring a description of collateral, second paragraph of comment 2. The purpose of requiring a description of collateral is evidentiary. We're trying to just determine the intent of the parties. That's what we talked about earlier. What did they intend the collateral to be? The test of sufficiency of a description under this section, as under the former Article 9 section, is that the description do the job assigned to it, make possible the identification of the collateral described. This section rejects any requirement that a description is insufficient unless it is exact and detailed, the so-called serial number test. I'm pretty sure I know what the drafter's intent was because they told me. And that's why I suggest that you all read the comments of these provisions. Okay. Bear in mind the comment isn't the law. The statute is the law. But the courts give great deference to the drafter's comments. So, a description of collateral, our description is all equipment, right? That's what we've been working with in problem, all customers' equipment, in problem 4. Which one of these in B picks this up? I'll tell you that it's an adequate description, and it's just and it's picked up in Part B within the safe harbor. Yeah.
Would that be a category?
Oddly enough, no. I have the same intuition, and honestly, I will call it a category sometimes because it's such an obvious English language word. But look at the next one, yeah.
Yeah, it's number 3 because it's defined actually.
A type of collateral defined in Article 9, and it turns out there's a definition of equipment. You know what the definition of equipment is? Goods that are not inventory, farm products, or consumer goods. That don't fit. It's a catch-all. So if I am a car dealer and I grant a security interest in all my equipment, and we get in a fight down the road, and the bank claims that it has a security interest in the tools that my mechanics use, does the statement all equipment work? Equipment is all goods other than inventory, stuff you sell. The cars out in the lot would not be equipment. Consumer goods, we're not in a consumer environment. And farm products, we're not in a farm environment. In a business environment, we're usually differentiating between inventory and equipment. So it is a type. But I think of a type as a generic category. Now you can make up your own category, and I see this happen all the time. And a bank will put in the description all machinery. Can you do it that way? Sure. Category is a generic grouping that you make up, as opposed to a generic grouping that's defined in the code. But now I've got a definition problem. If I said all equipment, would I have a security interest in the furniture in the waiting room at the dealership? If I said all machinery, would I? No. I mean, equipment is much broader and easier to use. So my advice to you is don't make up your own categories. Or if you make up your own category, define it very, very carefully. Because the code category, code types, do the work. Let's go ahead and do problem 5. I think we can do it. In problem 5, you have a business loan. Go back to problem 4. Bank loans customer $15,000, and this is now a business loan. So let's say the customer is, we've been talking about car lots. Let's say customer runs a used car lot and borrows $15,000 to pay employees or something like that. In other words, there's a business purpose for the loan. And do you all know what a sole proprietorship is? You had business associations. It's not an entity. It doesn't exist. If one is doing business as a sole proprietorship, one owns all the assets. It's not like a corporation owns the assets or an LLC. So we'll assume that the customer is running a used car lot as a sole proprietorship and owns all the assets on the lot, but also has lots of consumer goods, washing machine at home, consumer electronics, and so grants the bank a security interest in all consumer goods. So that is a generic description by type defined in the code. Consumer goods there's a somewhat complicated definition, but for our purposes it means goods used for personal, family, or household purposes. And I think we all have sort of an intuitive sense of the difference between consumer goods and business stuff. And we'll fine-tune that a little later, of course. So the description is all consumer goods. Is that a valid description under Article 9?
9108E 2 says that it's insufficient. Consumer goods.
Yeah, 9108E2 says a description only by type of collateral. Well, consumer goods is a type.
Mm-hmm.
They're very careful to use type there. Okay? The description only by type of collateral is an insufficient description. Insufficient means it just won't work as a matter of law. In a consumer transaction, consumer goods, and don't worry about security stuff, the rest of that. So in a consumer transaction, a description of the collateral as all consumer goods is insufficient as a matter of law. So you're claiming that description doesn't work.
Yes.
So you're sure of that? What's the predicate? Does that provision say that all consumer goods never works?
Only in a consumer transaction.
It doesn't work if the transaction is a consumer transaction. Is the transaction a consumer transaction? How would I know?
Yeah.
I'm sorry? Well, it could still be a consumer transaction. I mean, how do you know? It's consumer stuff as collateral and business purpose for the loan, right? So it's mixed. It's part business. It's got consumer aspects. And the question to you is it a consumer transaction or is it not a consumer transaction? And you are giving me lots of opinions, but how do I know? Well, you look up the definition of consumer transaction. Now look, this is a really piddly small rule. I gave you this because I want you all to focus hard on the statutes. This is a learn how to read statutes exercise, which I do a fair amount, particularly early in the course. 9102, remember it has 80-something definitions? And 9102A, let's just see ones in here. Consumer transaction is 26, right? 9102A 26?
Yeah.
Consumer transaction means a transaction in which, one, an individual incurs an obligation, primarily for personal, family, or household purposes. A security interest secures the obligation, and the collateral is held or acquired primarily for personal, family, or household purposes. And there's a subset of consumer transaction called a consumer goods transaction if the collateral is consumer goods, which it would be in this case. But the main definition is there. Is this a consumer transaction? There's an obligation, a security interest secures the obligation, and the collateral is used primarily for personal, family, or household purposes. But what about element 1, Romanet 1?
I would say no, because it says it's a business loan, so you're not acquiring it for personal, family, or household purposes.
In a consumer transaction, the loan must be for a consumer purpose, and the collateral must be for a consumer purpose. Both. Now you can say that that's bad policy, that our business person using consumer goods as collateral ought to get the benefit of that rule. But the idea is that if you're borrowing for a consumer purpose and you're using all your personal goods as collateral, that's overreaching. That lenders against consumer goods don't usually lend enough that it justifies an interest in all your consumer goods. That would give them access to too much stuff, more stuff than they need to pay off the loan. So, whether that's true or not, it was thought to be an overreach, and hence the rule. So, in a consumer transaction, the loan is for a consumer purpose, the collateral is held for a consumer purpose. And the easy example is consumer goods, but it could also be an investment property. For example, I had 4 kids, so I've got $3, and after the downturn recently, I've got $3 left in the securities market, but it's a personal investment. So I use my personal investment as collateral for a personal loan. That would be a consumer transaction. The easiest consumer transaction is consumer loan, consumer goods. Okay. So the answer to this problem is the description is perfectly fine from an Article 9 perspective because this is not a consumer transaction. Does everybody see the point? Again, trifling rule. I'm not going to lose any sleep if you all don't know this rule. But I do want you to read the statutes with just incredible care. And remember, I said on day 1, you got to go to the definitions over and over and over and over and over again. And this one's just definitional. What if the loan was for a consumer purpose? Now the description would be ineffective, right? Parent borrows money to pay child's tuition, grants a security interest in all consumer goods. What does the bank have a security interest in? Parent borrows money, it's personal loan, to pay child's tuition. Grants lender a security interest in all consumer goods. That's how the collateral is described. What does lender have a security interest in? Nothing. Business loan, the collateral is described as all assets of debtor. Any kind of loan, collateral is described as all assets of debtor. What does lender have a security interest in? Nothing, because those descriptions are legally insufficient as a matter of law. For policy reasons that one can agree with or disagree with. All right. So, go back through this if this is really still foundational. I know we covered a lot. I know your brains are full by the end of 75 minutes. But ask me questions next time. Slow me down at the outset if you have questions. Shoot me emails. I'm going to finish these moderately quickly. You have a list that I can get all the way through the next handout. Next class. Okay? I'm sorry. I haven't broken these down in the syllabus day by day, but there are readings that go with handout 4 in the syllabus, and that's handout is handout 4. What I want to do at the end of each